Bruce is quite familiar with shellbacks as he has spoken to us at least a couple of times back in the 1980s. Richard Burchell is a good friend of his, and like Richard, he was captain of the STV Pathfinder for many years. Bruce has since moved to the West Coast with his wife Sheila, where he acquired North Star of Herschel Island and sailed it extensively for 18 years while they raised 4 children aboard. That took a lot of courage, I am sure. He is the author of several books. His latest, Sisters of the Ice, is a biography of 2 British Columbia ships, Saint Roch and North Star of Herschel Island, that performed legendary service in the Canadian Arctic. He is here to tell us all about them and other notable voyages, ships, and sailors in the North. This presentation includes rare photographs and a short film clip. Please give Bruce a warm shellback wave and welcome.
Oi, can you hear me all? Yeah.
We can hear you.
Okay. I guess Ron's going to give me a hand here getting the screen set up.
Yes, you should be able to share your screen now.
It's nice to see so many familiar faces. I seem to be the only one who has aged, and I must say that I've never been introduced following What Shall We Do with the Drunken Sailor, but perhaps appropriate. Yeah. Okay. Share the screen. Here we go.
That's
There
it.
we are.
Okay, so I'm going to make the screen bigger, and hopefully you don't see my clutter now. Is that good?
That's good.
All right, let's get underway. And thanks again for the warm welcome. And I'll speed things up here. So I've long had an interest in Canadian Arctic history, and all of us have been watching with climate change as the ice pack has thinned up north, and we've had more and more foreign traffic going through there. I was disappointed to hear the United States has never recognized that this is actually a Canadian waterway. The most that we got under the Mulroney-Reagan era was that they would inform us when they were coming into our waters, but not ask permission. And then last year, of course, we had China saying they wanted to be at the Arctic Roundtable as well, which would mean they had a say in how the environmental standards and the policing. And so I just began to look at, when did all this Arctic sovereignty, when did Canada start looking after Arctic sovereignty? And we just have to dip back when the industrialized world ran on whale oil. Whaling ships left from all over the world. Whale oil was used in machinery, in factories, and street lamps and house lamps. There seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of it. These are ships down in New England. They're going to put those empty barrels aboard, and the voyages would go anywhere from 2 to 4 years. You wouldn't come back until the barrels were full of this liquid gold. So who were these whalers? Well, not this guy, but we did have other whalers here, and they were multi-ethnic group and people of different skin colors, and it didn't matter despite the rampant racism of the time what color your skin was. If you could catch the whales and get the ship home early, then you got promoted. So you could be an African-American man as a chief harpooner in charge of a boat crew of Caucasian men, just because you were the best at it. And some of these men actually rose to become first mates and even captains of their own ship. They would go up and down the North Atlantic and then the South Atlantic looking for whales. And when they'd fished out those waters, they went around the corner at Cape Horn and fetched up in San Francisco, where they'd go up and down the North and South Pacific. And every so often they would stick their nose up through the Bering Strait into the Arctic looking for whales, and they saw a lot of ice and not much else. But one year, one fellow followed a lead, an opening in the pack, and he went deep into the Canadian Arctic, and he got caught in the ice and frozen in for the winter. Now, he later said that he did this on purpose, and hard to believe, though, that he'd risk his ship being crushed by the ice and them living in, minus 40 to 60 degrees and eating salt pork and salt beef, while his competitors were down in the South Pacific filling their holds with whale oil and perhaps having shore leave with dusky maidens with flowers in their hair. But anyway, it was the right choice, because when the pack broke up in the summer, there were whales as far as the horizon, because he'd found the breeding grounds of the bowhead whale. They quickly filled their hold. They're back in San Francisco within the year, and they had turned a huge profit for their owners, and everybody got paid off early. And word got around, and this sort of, just to give you an idea, this is where they went up. This is Herschel Island down in the far left of the screen. It's got the only natural harbor along the whole Yukon coast. So all these American ships went up there the next year, about 12 of them, and they settled in for the winter. Now, some of the captains brought along their wives and children, and they would entertain between the ships, and they would have ships concerts, and they would have banquets, and they would have game nights. But most of the working sailors figured the best way to get through the long, cold, dark winter was just to get drunk. And here they are arriving at Pauline Cove at Herschel Island, and then coming ashore. And they were described by one observer as being a drunken, raucous orgy of human depravity. They soon met up with the locals, Inuit, in the Canadian Arctic. These are the Inuvialuit, and they asked them to go and get the fresh caribou and fish. They didn't want to be eating the salt pork, and so they traded with these Inuit with exotic foodstuffs like coffee and tea and sugar and salt and hardtack and flour. And the Inuit diet changed forever immediately. They went from this nomadic hunting trapping society to wanting these Western foodstuffs. Well, the whalers then introduced them to guns. Some of them did have some old rusty rifles. Most of them were still using bows and arrows and spears, but they gave them repeating rifles so they can go and get more game for them, more food for them. Some of these Inuit became just deadly shots and volunteered in the first two world wars as snipers. Well, what's the fun with guns without booze? So they introduced them to alcohol, and unsurprisingly, that had a negative effect. They also introduced them to disease with no natural immunity to things like the influenza. The Inuit were dropping like flies. In the worst year at Herschel Island, of the 100 Inuvialuit living there, 90 of them died. So whole families, whole communities wiped out. And because they kept their history in the oral tradition of just passing on the stories from one generation to the next, whole histories were lost. Well, as it turns out, the whalers didn't just want fresh meat. They also wanted women. And at that time, it was just considered polite in Inuit society that if a lonely traveler came through your community and wanted, how shall I say, a female companionship, then you would just loan them your wife or your daughter. And some of these women ended up living on board the whaling ship while their husbands slept on deck. Other whalers moved ashore with them, and actually there were some did fall in love and decided to stay ashore with their new families. But there were many children born, and that can be seen in the surnames of the Inuvialuit these days. So you've got the Carpenters, which were the Charpentier from France, and the Grubens is another family name from Germany, the Eliases from England. There's even a whole family of Thrashers, which is the name of one of the sailing ships. So Hollywood got a hold of this and made somewhat of a salacious film about Eskimos and their love life. And when this poster didn't sell, then they went with Eskimo wife traders, the strangest love story ever told. Well, word got back, started filtering back to the mainland, and the Canadian government was doing nothing about these thousands of whalers, American whalers up in this Canadian island. But the Anglican Church sent out 2 missionaries, and they wrote back to the government at the time and just said, you've got a big problem here. You've got these foreign vessels in here. They have not cleared customs. They're not paying for the import duties, and they are giving the local indigenous people trade goods, including guns and alcohol, and they're making babies. And the government did nothing. And finally, after a few years, they sent out 2 of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police to take order of these 1,500, 1,800 whalers. And the police wrote back their report and said, yeah, we do have a problem here, but their case was somewhat diminished because one of the police officers had himself taken on a temporary Inuit wife, and they'd had a child together. Things weren't going so well in the Eastern Arctic either. There was all kinds of trappers and explorers going through the Canadian North. Everybody just figured that this was a no man's land. This fellow here, Otto Sverdrup from Norway, he spent years in Fram charting and claiming and naming all of these islands in the Canadian Arctic, claiming them for Norway. And the Canadian government was doing nothing about this. One fellow who was watching all of this was Joseph Eliza Bernier from Quebec. He'd grown up on his father's and grandfather's lumber ships. They would take spar lumber, so round stock from Quebec over to England, and then they would go down to the Caribbean and pick up sugar and rum and come back up. And so Bernier was growing up on the boat, and his father saw that he was going to be following in the family footsteps. And so one time when they were out and a big storm was coming, he took his young lad up forward and lashed him to the windlass in the bounciest part of the ship and said, if you're going to be a sailor, you may as well get the seasickness out of you now. And it seemed to have worked, because by the time he was 17, he had enough sea miles and enough knowledge that he became the youngest licensed sea captain in the world. Well, Bernier had a great career ashore and afloat, but he was watching the Arctic, and he wanted to sail a ship up as far as he could to the North Pole, take a dog sled up, claim the North Pole for Canada and all the lands below it. So he kept on petitioning the government, and finally the Laurier government chipped in, and Bernier put in his life savings, and they bought this ship, which they named Arctic. And Bernier felt he was on his way to the North Pole, but they said, the first year we need you to go and resupply some police posts and deliver some mail. Well, Bernier was very disappointed, but he was actually very smart, because two of the boxes you have to tick in asserting Arctic sovereignty is that you have a police force and that you are delivering the mail. Unfortunately for Bernier, during that year, two different Americans both claimed to have reached the North Pole, and so that was out. So Bernier said, it's okay, we'll go to plan B. Plan B is, we're going to take our ship and we'll go up to each of the islands in the Arctic. We'll anchor off, we'll row ashore, we'll build a cairn of stone, put a message in it saying this is Canadian, raise the flag, sing the song, and then move on to the next island. And that's what they did, and they got through about 7 islands, but while they were up there, they realized that there's a whole lot more islands than what anybody knew. What the Canadian government didn't know, what the Inuit didn't know, only God knew, that in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, there's 36,563 islands. It's an area about 3 times the size of Texas and about 11 times the size of England. So plan C, a guy named Senator Poirier said, let's just draw an imaginary line from the North Pole to the eastern and western extremities of the Canadian mainland. You go up one side, send a dog team up the rest, and down the far side, you meet in the middle at the bottom, and everything within that little triangle, or that big triangle, will be Canadian. So they spent the next few years doing that, and they finally met up at the base at Perry Rock at Melville Island, and they built their cairn and they put a plaque on it, and they claimed all this for Canada officially. Well, that was helpful, but what was really helpful was that a fellow out in the Nova Scotia found out how to draw oil from the ground, and it was cheap. You didn't have to go away on a whaling ship for years at a time. You could just work the mine. He called it coal oil. We later called it kerosene. This is an editorial cartoon of the whales all celebrating, and it was just as well because the whale stocks were much diminished in the Arctic by now. They'd just been pretty much wiped out. All well and good until this French fashion designer came up with this contraption to give women a hourglass figure, and he needed a strong, flexible material for it. And the best thing he found was whale baleen, sort of the filter from a baleen whale, filtered from their mouth. And so the ships were going back up there again, and they were just knocking the heads off the whales and just taking the baleen and letting the carcasses of the whales drift away. Well, that fashion ran its course. Then people started buying jeans with holes already in them for hundreds of dollars, or maybe I'm getting ahead of myself there. Fashion's a fickle mistress. Here's a guy standing with a whaler standing with some hands of baleen, just to give you an idea of the size of them. Well, there had been a side trade going on during the whaling industry with fur trading. And this fellow here, C.T. Peterson, Christian Theodore Peterson, he grew up on his father's whaling ship in the Arctic. He became captain of his own whaling ship, but he grew up with the Inuit, with the Inuvialuit. So he knew them as friends. He spoke their language, and so he just started bringing up trade goods for them, any kind of specialty item that they wanted. He had this huge ship called Patterson that he would just load full of things to trade with the Inuit and come back with fur, and he was making a very, very good living. His competition, of course, was the Hudson's Bay Company. HBC here before Christ, but they were everywhere, but they had very, very limited stock. So one or two types of tea, one or two types of coffee, some blankets and traps. But Peterson knew what the Inuit wanted. So he would stop in Alaska, and one delicacy that they wanted was blue whale muktuk. There's no blue whale in the Arctic. So the Alaskan Inuit would get a seal and turn it inside out, and then just fill it up with whale blubber, a nice waterproof container there. And he'd just taken hundreds of these to trade. He also brought up these small vessels that were misnamed schooners, Arctic schooners or Eskimo schooners. And the Inuit saw that they could fit a whole lot of supplies to get them through the winter on these vessels. And then they would bring them back full of fur for him. So he was making quite a living. A very, very successful businessman. So another guy he was known by some as Old Charlie, Old Clinky to others, and in the memoirs of one St. Roch crew member, that bastard, and this is Christian Klingenberg. He came out of Denmark, 14 years old. He was a cook's assistant, sailed all over the world, eventually wound up in Alaska, where he met and fell in love with an Inuit woman who taught him how to live in the north, how to dress, how to hunt and fish and trap, and how to hunt whales from floes. So he got work on a whaling ship. And one day he went ashore for a walk and he saw footprints in the snow. And he thought, aha, I have discovered the elusive blonde Eskimo. Now, there had been reports of blonde Eskimo throughout the Canadian Arctic for hundreds of years. So John Franklin wrote about them. So these are Inuit. They kept to themselves, very nomadic, European facial features, light or blonde hair and lighter blue eyes. And he thought, they have not been introduced to all these wonderful trade goods like coffee and tea and alcohol and guns. So if I only had my own trading ship full of goods, then I could go and find them and I'd have the monopoly and make my fortune. As luck would have it, when he got to, here he is with some of his family, just to give you an idea. When he got to Herschel, there was a captain there, Captain McKenna, and he had two trading ships, and he just fired the captain of a ship named Olga. So he hired Klingenberg to be captain, and he said, you're on probation. We're not looking for blonde Eskimo. We're going from Herschel to this other island, do our trade, and come back. But stay within sight of me, what we'd call buddy boating now, I guess. So they leave, but a gale comes up, the ships get separated, fog rolls in, and when the fog lifts, Olga is gone. And everyone figures that Klingenberg really wasn't a captain, didn't really know what he was doing. The ship was probably crushed by the ice. And in any case, if they made it ashore, they only had 2 weeks provision for the 9 crew, so they were goners. So she was written off. Next year, big year though at Herschel Island, because this vessel showed up. This is Joa with Roald Amundsen, and he's just made the first transit of Canada's Northwest Passage. He actually could have done it in 1 year, but he stayed over 2 winters because he wanted to study magnetic north, the variation between true and magnetic north, and to calculate it. And for all you navigators out there, I'm sure you're all watching as I am, because it's been moving very, very slowly across Canada for all this time, and now it's suddenly accelerated, and it'll be in Siberia in no time at all. Something that Amundsen would have been fascinated by. So here's Amundsen and his crew. It was quite a big deal that the Northwest Passage had finally been conquered, I guess you could say. Another fellow who showed up in Herschel that year was Wilmer Stephenson, Icelandic, American, Canadian. He was there at the behest of the Canadian government, and the government is now saying that they wanted him to lead this thing called the Canadian Arctic Expedition, to find out what land is actually up there, who is living on it, and what resources they were. Now, and then over the horizon to complete the triumvirate, here comes Klingenberg back in Olga, and he went ashore and he said to the police, I regret to inform you that on this trip of my 9 crew, 4 perished. 1 was eaten by a bear, 2 fell through the ice. The other one, though, made a still out of our meager supplies, got drunk and attacked me, so I shot him dead. At that time, whaling captains, because they're away for so long, were second only to God, and so you could mete out any punishment you wanted. But they said, but you're a Dane on an American ship in Canadian waters. We're not sure what to do. So give us some time and wait here. So we agreed to wait there, but that that night he stole a whaleboat and took his family and went across the border to Alaska, and the police had no boat to chase after him. A warrant was issued for arrest. Years later, he turned himself in, but down in San Francisco with no evidence and no witnesses, he was acquitted. But Stephenson wrote this book called The Friendly Arctic in the meantime, where he talked about blonde Eskimo. He called them Copper Inuit. And none of the locals liked it because Stephenson said, hey, the Arctic's not this terrible, harsh place to live in. There's all kinds of food and there's all kinds of clothing and friendly people. And the gist of the book was anybody could go up there. And the locals were saying, well, that's because we have to take care of you when you're up here. And they didn't want to have a whole bunch of people showing up who were unprepared. But one guy who did read this book was Henry Larsen from Norway. He was fascinated by the Canadian Arctic. He'd also left as a teenager, gone sailing around the world, went back to Norway, got his navigation papers or his captain's tickets, and he got work on a steamship. And the steamship came up and around and docked in Seattle, where he happened to be ashore and bumped into fellow countryman Roald Amundsen. And Amundsen took the young man under his wing and said, somebody of your skill and drive, if you can make it up to the Arctic, there's all kinds of adventure and work for you. So Larsen was quite chuffed by this, quite excited by this. And he saw that, read in the paper that Klingenberg was actually in Seattle and he'd found himself a trading ship. And so Larsen went over and got hired on as navigator on this vessel, the Maid of Orleans. And Klingenberg said, look, I've got all my trade goods and I've got lumber to build my own trading post. I've even got lumber to build a school. And I've hired a school teacher to come with us. And so he's going to be completely set up in the Canadian Arctic. Well, they left and they got to Alaska. Here's the crew, nice little crew shot there. The crew was mostly Klingenberg's children and some Inuit. Well, when they got to Alaska, they happened to bump into Knut Rasmussen. He's a Danish failed opera singer who turned explorer, and he just crossed the Canadian Arctic by dog team. And so Larsen was sitting there with these very famous Arctic people, Rasmussen and Klingenberg, and little did he know that in just a few years he would be famous as well. Well, they had what's called a 2-day party. They ended up at Herschel Island, and the police had not forgotten about Klingenberg. And Klingenberg said, well, I'm here to build my trading post deep in the Arctic. And they said, well, you're not allowed to. The rules have changed. You actually can't leave from here. And they said, Klingenberg said, well, my wife and children have gone ahead to this island, Victoria Island. I need to get them supplies for the winter. So they said, well, it's a mission of mercy, but we don't trust you. So you're gonna need to take along one of our officers. And the guy chosen for the job was a strapping young lad from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. As it turns out, a distant relative of mine. His name's Ian Moore Macdonald. And Macdonald was very no nonsense. He went on board with his notebook, did a full inventory right down to the last sail needle to make sure that nothing was traded, that we were only just giving supplies to the family. Well, they made the drop off, but on the way back, the fellow at the helm, Inuit fellow Fred Wilkie, noticed Macdonald on deck, and then Macdonald wasn't there. So he sounded the alarm, took the ship's boat out, and found Macdonald's parka folded neatly and floating with the notebook on top, but Macdonald was not found. So Klingenberg again had to go back to the police at Herschel and say, I regret to inform you that on this voyage, Macdonald was lost. And partly because of Klingenberg's reputation and partly because Macdonald was an officer, there was a huge investigation, but there was also the thought that Macdonald was said to be related to the first person who started the police force and the first prime minister of the country, Sir John A. Anyway, there was no evidence and he was once again acquitted. Klingenberg had many, many more adventures in the Arctic, but he ended up dropping Henry Larsen at Herschel Island, and Henry just loved it there. He got to meet the Inuit, he got to meet the locals, he met the top trapper in Canada, Fred Carpenter, and they became very, very good friends. The family of Inuvialuit, these are the Pokiaks, and the gentleman there was actually engineer aboard North Star, who we'll be talking about later. Well, he also met, Larsen also met this fellow Paisley, and this is Paisley when he was in the Royal Navy, and Paisley's service record is somewhat spotty. And you got in trouble for insubordination or intoxication, you might spend the night in the brig, but Paisley's record was more like spent 12 days in the brig, followed by 14 days in the brig, followed by 19 days in the brig. And eventually he gave up that career and he moved to Canada and joined the RCMP. And he told Larson to just spend a couple more years in country. You can become a Canadian citizen, or in those days, a British subject. And then you can join the RCMP. And the reason you should is we're building this huge ship called St. Roch to patrol the area. I'm going to be your captain. I'll hire you as navigator. Well, St. Roch was built, and this is here in Sea Trials in English Bay, where actually I'm moored right now. And Paisley got married, and he informed the RCMP that he'd be taking his wife with him. And they said, no, you won't. And so he quit. But Larson stayed on as navigator. And when the ship got up to the Arctic, he was made captain. Now, the ship was made quite a statement. This was the first time the Canadian government had actually invested substantially in asserting their sovereignty. So this is, the ship was used for patrolling the waters, going from island to island during the summer. During the winter, she's round hulled so that she could be iced in, and then they could then send dog sleds out, dog teams out to the various communities, or if people needed help, they could come in. The ship was used for delivering building supplies to different communities, taking in medicine or food, taking sick people to the hospital. But as a ship, she also made a statement. She was nicknamed the Big Ship. She was built of massive fir planks on oak frames or ribs, and she had a second hull of ice sheathing built of iron bark, a very, very dense wood. The ice sheathing did protect the hull from the ice, but its main job was to actually hold the caulking in on the inner hull, because the single-hulled vessels, when they got cold, the planks would contract and the caulking would fall out. So she was purpose-built for the Arctic. And one person who was watching this ship very carefully was this top trapper, this Inuit Invaluate fellow, Fred Carpenter. He also wanted a big ship. He was taking so much fur down to the mainland to trade that he wanted that. He also wanted, I think, a bit of a status symbol. But in the case of a epidemic or a famine or any kind of emergency, he wanted to take all of his family and friends off of the island where he's living, Banks Island, and be able to get down for help on the mainland. So he and his buddy, his brother-in-law, Fred Wilkie, went around and they said they made a list of all the things they would want in a ship. So they did want the big, thick fir planks. They wanted the oak frames. They wanted the iron bark. Unlike St. Roch that has this big bluff bow, they wanted a very, very sharp bow for cutting through the ice. Most of these small vessels that were coming up arrived with no pilot house or deck house, just a pile of lumber, and the Inuit or the sailors would, scarpers would just cobble something together. And then it wasn't seaworthy, but it was ugly, and they didn't want that. So they wanted something built integral to the hull. And Fred said the only other thing is it has to have an Atlas engine. It's the only engine I trust, only engine I know how to use, a big make and break, a big hand crank engine. Well, they took all their ideas to this fellow, Ole Andresen, as he could draw, and he came up with the ship's plans for a vessel to be called North Star. And they took these plans to Peterson, and Peterson looked at the big planks and the fine bow, and this is by far the largest private vessel that ever would have been imported. And he knew that they were doing well in the fur trade. But this is the height of the Depression. No one had money. People were standing in bread lines. And he came back to them and said, you know, guys, it's going to be about, in today's dollars, close to $400,000. And he figured that would be it. The next day, Fred Carpenter showed up with a box of money and said, go build me my boat. So Peterson went down to San Francisco and he went to this fellow here. He was the top boat builder at building ships for the Arctic, George Washington Nice, G.W. Nice. Nice's shipyards kept on burning down. He was always at work, always working on the ships, just loved working around boats. And the rumor was, never proved, that it was his wife who was the arsonist because she wanted him to be spending more time at home, so she kept on torching them. But anyway, this was his shop down in San Francisco. So they started building the ship. They got her in frame. They went to Atlas and ordered the motor. And Atlas said, actually, due to the Depression, we're pretty much shutting down. We don't build them anymore. And they telegraphed up to Fred Carpenter and said, we we'll find you a different motor. And Fred said, never mind, just bring me back my money. Well, this is terrible because all these people had finally been put back to work. So Atlas agreed to cobble together one last Atlas motor, and that was installed in North Star. So here she is. She's all brand new and spiffy. Just for, you can see the fellow down here, that's the insurance agent, just to give you an idea of of how big she is. And you can see her underwater configuration, just like St. Roch. So she's egg-shaped, she's round hull, and that means she can get squeezed up and out of the ice rather than crushed by the ice. We've, just as an aside, Niece's daughter contacted me out of the blue a number of years ago and said that she could remember crawling around on North Star when she was being built. And Niece's daughter told me that she would be in port where we were and she'd love to come and visit the boat. So I really wanted to show her that we were taking care of, you know, her father's treasure there. And so we had, well, us and the kids, my wife and the kids and I, we scrubbed everything and we polished the brass and we made sure the vessel was gleaming and she'd be proud. And she showed up with her seeing eye dog. Turns out she'd been blind since birth. She forgot to mention that to me when we were talking, but she couldn't see the shiny brass, but she did have a good feeler on the boat anyway. Anyway, North Star is put aboard Patterson. They use a big crane at the dock and lift her on board. And I'd always been told that by people who had been there at the time, that she was built in 1935, but didn't go north till 36. And then a couple of years ago, a woman contacted me. Her father, Jim, had just passed away, and in going through his papers, she'd come across a journal he'd kept as a teenager when he had the coolest summer job ever, working aboard Patterson, delivering North Star up to the Arctic. And bless his heart, he took pictures. Here they are leaving, and this bridge is just being built, and this would later be called the Golden Gate Bridge. On deck, the crew would lounge around on North Star as they headed north. They did hit some rough weather a few times. They poured oil over the side to calm the seas. They put extra lashings on North Star. Other days they went fishing for cod off the ship, and when they got up north, they all jumped over the side and went for a swim. And probably, I imagine there were no shower facilities on board, and these teenage boys were pretty ripe by then. They finally made it up to the Arctic. You can see North Star on deck there, and here she is entering the pack, the pan ice, and coming around the corner, and here she is. But of course, there's no crane there, so how do you launch a big ship like this? So Peterson put all the ballast over on the starboard side of Patterson to heel her over, and they put some straps around North Star and ran a line up aloft and down to a donkey winch. He put his son on charge of the donkey winch, Ted Jr., and they launched her into the Arctic in 1935, August 1st, 35. Fred Carpenter got aboard. He got all of his winter supplies, and he took the ship up to Banks Island. And on the left there with the fur ruff, that's his mom, Duana. She lived in the deck house all the time the ship was out at sea, and his sister, Susie, there. A happy looking bunch. Here's a happier picture with Fred with some of his kids. Fred actually had 16 children with 3 different wives. No wonder he's smiling. Okay, so most of the time North Star was hauled on the beach and just frozen and just kept in the freezer, because the Arctic, his navigation season was probably about 3 weeks at that time. The rest of the time they were out on with their dog team to pick up white fox mainly. This picture, of course, taken during daylight, but the time they were operating would have been when they don't get the sun up north, and they'd be running 100-mile trap lines, be out for 2 weeks, sleeping in snow tents, snow huts or tents. And every time you pick up a frozen fox, that just adds more weight to your sled. One guy, these are tough men, figured out that if he could thaw out the animals, then he could skin them and they'd have less weight. So at the end of the cold day, he'd climb inside his snow hut, and then he'd just pack all the frozen carcasses of the foxes around him, and so they would thaw out overnight and he could get them in the morning. Then they would just hang these fox pelts to bleach in the sun, and this is the way they made their living. Now, why fox pelts? Well, at that time, black and white photography, what they found was that when the light hit the white fox pelt, it gave an ethereal glow, an angelic glow to the person wearing it. And so this became all the rage, and everybody wanted to have these so they could glow like angels, I guess. So they'd fill the ship up with fur, tons of fur, and then as soon as the water was open, they would head down to the mainland to trap. Now there were dozens and dozens, in fact, 100 of these ships, vessels, right across the Canadian Arctic, biggest congregation in the Western Arctic, most of them about 35, 40 feet. And when they rolled into town during the thaw to trade, I guess it was like the Rolling Stones coming to town. They would just take over, and apocryphally, they would say that they'd have one bag of money for their supplies and the other was just to party and gamble with. And then back out into the ice and try and get home before freeze up. The decks would be crowded with children and families and dogs and all the stuff that they needed to get through the winter. 3 times North Star wasn't fast enough to get out of the ice, and she was frozen solid, and they trapped off the ship during the winter. You see the sleds, they're up on the starboard bow. It was all about the dogs, though. This is what drove them. North Star would carry about 35 dogs and 1 wolf that they kept to breed their dogs with, so they'd be more resilient to the cold and much tougher like these guys. Well, this trade was going on back and forth, and they were just, between them, these top trappers had a kindergarten education, but they were raking in money when, as I say, most people were standing in bread lines. Meanwhile, St. Roch continued her patrols. She went down every so often to the mainland, down to Vancouver, to pick up more supplies. And on one of these, during World War II, Larson was given the top secret orders. He was not to tell his crew that he was to take St. Roch through the Northwest Passage and get to Greenland. There was a cryolite mine in Greenland for making aluminum. They were worried the Germans were going to take it over, so they wanted to sneak St. Roch in there, and thus hence the top secret orders. And Larson put his boat into haul out, and he said, okay, then I want a sharp bow like North Star's, I want a bigger engine, and I want the rig cut down from schooner to catch. We've got too much top hampage there. And they said, well, with the war rationing, all we can give you is the sharper bow. So they bolted on the sharper bow, and St. Roch is headed for the Northwest Passage. But as she gets up there, they get a telegraph that Fred Welke, his friend Fred Welke, the Inuit, had died and left a huge estate, and they needed the RCMP to go up to sort out the estate to make sure that it was all done fairly. Now, it was 150 miles from where St. Roch got iced in to Saxe Harbor on Banks Island. It was rough going like this, and they were sleeping rough and getting beat up the whole way. That's 150 miles, about 240 kilometers. They averaged about 11 miles per day, and they finally got there and met up with Fred and with Fred's sister Susie. And it happened to be Easter weekend, and Susie said, well, you should rest, now that you've solved this estate, and have Easter dinner with us. And because Fred was the leader, they had 36 guests, 36 Inuit, plus the 4 RCMP. And she served up a big Easter dinner, big caribou steaks and all the fixings. And the guys just must have thought this was heaven after being out in the trail for 2 weeks. And then Fred, who was always buying things and into the latest gizmos and gadgets, had bought himself a little Brownie movie camera. And so he decided afterwards that he'd pull out a battery and set up a movie projector and show them a movie. And most of these guys had never seen a picture of themselves. I swear 90% of them, if that, had ever seen a movie before. And so Fred was going to entertain them. So just imagine you're sitting there in this little small house on the edge of the Arctic. You've just spent 2 weeks on the trail. You're battered and bruised, but you've got a belly full of caribou. It's nice and warm inside, and you know that the next morning you're going to be getting up and heading back for 2 more weeks out in the cold. And Fred's going to show you some movies. Now, the Carpenter family is very, very protective of these movies, but because we're friends with them and they like what my wife and I have done with the ship, and because this is for educational purposes, I can show you a small clip of what Fred showed. This is the exact movie that Fred showed them that night. So here they are taking the furs and grading them. These are the furs that have come off of North Star. Now, like I say, I can't say it enough. This is during the Depression. There's hardly any money. Each of these pelts is worth somewhere between $18 and $38 at the time in those dollars. It really is just a big pile of money. And then you go into the trading post and you put your money down and you can buy the basics from here. Fred was quite wealthy and also taking care of a lot of people up there, so he would often buy everything. Now here's some people who I think are being filmed for the first time and they have no idea what's going on, of what they're supposed to be doing inside that funny box you're staring at me, you're showing to me here. Here's one of Fred's kids climbing aboard North Star. Of the several hours of footage that I've got of Fred, that Fred took, I would say 90% of it is of North Star. He just loved the ship. Here they are on the trail. They've stopped for a mug up, stopped for a cup of tea, put up a windbreak. And this is North Star. They would haul her out by putting a line to her bow and to her stern, and the whole village would come out and just heave on the line. Sometimes it took 3 days to just inch her out and get all these different vessels out. There's another one of these $10,000 clotheslines, and the fur just bleaching in the sun. Now this, I'm pretty sure, was shot on what would have been Dominion Day, or what we call Canada Day now. What I like about it is that it shows how the RCMP and the Inuit, they were all part of the same community. They were all friends. They all got along. They all supported one another, and they played and ate together, and just very, very good relations. Lots of mutual respect. So they're just having some games there, and as you'll note, Fred tries to make sure that North Star is in every shot. And this was some later footage that was spliced in. It just sort of just shows you North Star's colors down in the delta. I have no idea what's going on with all these flowers, but I suppose it was a real specialty. It was a luxury item that they're going to take back up north. Now I knew how they got the ship out. I never knew how you could push the ship back in the water. And of course, as Archimedes said, if you give me a lever, I can move the earth. There's no trees up there. They're way above the tree line, but these logs would float up from the Mackenzie Delta and they'd be saved for this purpose. And they would go out. They're launching this. This is a ship called Reindeer. So she's probably around 35 ton. There's North Star waiting to be launched. And then there's a Mi'kmaq who's probably around 30 ton. And she floats. Come on. One more big heave on the stern, and then somebody better grab a line. Right. Anyway, so that was part of the movie that he showed, and then St. Roch left, and she tried to make it through the passage, but she kept on grounding out, and she ended up having to spend another winter. She finally made it over in the third season to Halifax, and it was such a big secret that this was such a secret mission that no one knew she was coming, and the Canadian Navy turned their guns on her as she entered harbor. By this time, the cryolite situation in Greenland had been resolved, but Larson got his refit, got a new deck house, cut the rig down, got the new motor, and they were back going through the Northwest Passage. They figured it would take 2 years, but he kept on finding lead after lead and made it through in one season. He did one more year up to resupply in the Arctic, and then of course St. Roch went down through the Panama Canal and then became the first vessel to circumnavigate North America. And she's now on display at the Vancouver Maritime Museum, but she was retired. The other ships kept on going. That's North Star second in. Fewer and fewer of them as the fur trade slowly started to wane. Fred kept on buying things. Here's the first snowmobile or snow machine to go up into the Arctic sitting on North Star's deck, and he bought other fun contraptions like this fancy new Ringer washing machine. One year they decided to stay down on the mainland, and so Banks Island sat uninhabited. This is a picture taken on Rat Sunday, so the pelts down there instead of white fox were muskrat. And so instead of putting money in the collection plate, you put in muskrat pelts. Well, with Banksland sitting uninhabited, the Secret Service communication was that both the United States and Russia were looking at putting missile silos on there. This is, of course, around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they needed the island occupied. So they went to Fred and they asked him, would you please go up and hold this land for Queen and Country? It's right at the entrance to the Northwest Passage. Well, Fred was a very proud Canadian, and he loved the Queen, and he said he would do it, but only if they built a if they built a school at Banks Island so that his kids didn't have to go down to residential school. And the only other thing he wanted was a stronger radio reception so he could get the CBC, because he was tired of listening to the American radio station. He actually filled the ship with so many volunteers, they got a second ship, Reindeer, and they went up and they held the land. And for this, Fred was given a special medal that he wore in his caribou anorak, and that medal came from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. Well, a few years later, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip were in town. They're in Tuktoyaktuk, and Fred was their host and tour guide, and they ended up spending a few days together, and I guess that they became pretty chummy. And at one point, Philip started saying some pretty Philippian things, and he asked Fred, what do you think of my wife? And Fred said, well, I love her. She's my queen. She's the Queen of Canada. And Philip said, no, what do you think of her as a man? Fred was horrified, but it wasn't his first time around the block. So he just looked at Philip and said, well, not bad for a white woman. Here she is with a young Jean Chrétien. I wrote to Her Majesty about 15, 20 years ago and said, if you ever wondered what happened to your Inuit friends and North Star, and I told her some stories. I didn't think anything would come of it. And she wrote back immediately. Of course, I remembered. And she added some details. And since then, we've been corresponding once or twice a year. Anyway, the next thing that happened was somebody developed Max Ward developed the float plane. And suddenly you didn't need to risk your life being out on the Beaufort Sea or risk being frozen in. Somebody could come in and pick up your fur, and you could go down with them and do all of your trading and be back the same day or within a couple of days. So people just started abandoning their ships, and they were being broken up and used for firewood or for building other things. Fred kept on going, though. He ran North Star right through 61. He was the last ship going. And when he died, they engraved a picture of North Star on his headstone up at Banks Island. A couple of years ago, I had to replace the false stem on North Star's bow, so I carved a little figurehead for her, and my wife affectionately named the polar bear Fred. So Fred's still watching out over North Star. However, before he sold the ship, before he died, he sold the ship to this fellow here, Sven Borg Johansson, a Swedish man. He'd been in the World War II. He became disillusioned with man's inhumanity to man, so he became a self-imposed hermit, living off the land, trapping and hunting, and one point shot and left for dead in a snowbank. And another time he fell in with some Laplanders who taught him about reindeer husbandry. And when he heard Canada was looking for somebody to look after the reindeer herds in the Arctic, he moved over, and on one of his trips, he came across North Star, and he fell in love with her, and he pictured her as a fully rigged ship with her fine clipper bow and sailing around the world. So he bought the ship and he took her down to the mainland where the Canadian government was looking for a ship to charter because they were interested if there was any oil and gas deposits out in the Beaufort Sea. So North Star started that with hydrostatic testing and did that for a number of years. And then he and his wife Norma, they had a little daughter, and they decided to take her down to the mainland, down to British Columbia to go to school. Before they left, though, there was a request from Pierre Trudeau's government that when the BC-Alaska boundary had been divided up, in this one section of the water, the Portland Canal, there's 4 islands, and on the original charts, 2 of the islands were on the Canadian side and 2 on the American side. And when the new American charts came out, the Canadian islands had drifted over to the American side. So he was asked to go and find the original survey marks and report back. And he reported back that 3 of the islands should have originally been Canadian, and he suggested they go back to 2 and 2. And this went to an international tribunal in Paris, where they agreed with Sven, and that was just another use that North Star had for sovereignty. Well, he copper bottomed the boat because she was going to be going south, and he put the full rig on her, and he would careen her over in the islands. But he needed to find a way to make some money, and an American contacted him and wanted to charter North Star to be the first private vessel through the Northwest Passage. And Sven didn't want to go back up north with North Star, so they purchased this other ship, and it took him 6 years of trying, battering through the old ice. But finally, he made it through, and Sven was the first captain of a private vessel through Canada's Northwest Passage. All those years of doing that paid North Star's bills. Then some people had been sailing across the Pacific, and they came across a pod of mer creatures, and Cambridge University heard about this, and so they chartered North Star to go up to south of the Aleutian Islands to look for mermaids. And when they came back from that trip, the federal government was looking at opening up logging in this old growth forest, which is the home of the spirit bear, the Kermode bear. So some environmental groups chartered North Star, and on that trip, they named that piece of land the Great Bear Rainforest. And it's now a protected piece of land, and they make far more money from ecotourism than from cutting down trees. Well, Sven was flown to Ottawa to receive the Order of Canada, and he thought it would be for being the first captain through the Northwest Passage, or his work with North Star. And he asked somebody just before he went up to get the award, "What's this for?" And they said reindeer herding, and he thought this was hilarious. This is him trying to keep a straight face. He thought it was the least of things he'd ever done. But he was getting ready to go around the world, and we all knew that. The ship was sitting out at anchor in Victoria, and Sven looked up in the rigging one day, and he saw a vision of dancers dancing around in the rigging, and he realized in that moment that he wasn't a soldier, he wasn't an Arctic sailor, he wasn't a big game hunter or a trapper, he was a choreographer. So he went down below and he fired up the generator and put on some records. He formed a dance company. He built a piece of equipment, basically a hidden fulcrum with a bosun's chair on the end of it, where he could lift dancers up into the sky. And he won the top honor in the Prague Ballet, and same down in North Carolina. And suddenly his dance company was in great demand, but he'd stopped sailing the ship. And my wife and I were looking for a ship. We were looking for a boat to raise our kids on and have our own adventures. And we'd become very friendly with Sven, spent a lot of time on the ship. And we kept on asking him or teasing him, "When are you going to sell us your ship?" And one day he agreed. So we moved aboard with our daughters, and then people started knocking on the boat saying that they had been promised the boat by Sven and he should have sold to them. And I think that Sven just liked our little family, but also he knew that I could speak square rig. I spent my youth on board this ship Pathfinder that some of you know. She and her sister ship Playfair now are operated by a group called Briggs Youth Sail Training out of Hamilton, and I got my start there, and then had the privilege of being captain of this ship for many years. And one of your fellow Shellback members who's listening today, Richard Burchill, was captain before me and trained me up. The ship's sailed as much as possible 24 hours a day in all weathers. So an excellent form of training if you know of any teenagers that want to get involved. Briggs Youth Sail Training. So here's a little boat porn for you sailors out there, you brig rats. So anyway, he knew that I could sail the ship, or at least fake it, and could maintain her. We got to work right away, sewing the sails, getting the boat ready. My wife ended up sewing 2 complete new suits of sails for the ship over the next 25 years. We invited a couple of foster children into our family, and we raised everyone up until their late teens. The last child left after university. We sailed all over the place, thousands and thousands of miles for 18 seasons. And sometimes we just seek out remote anchorages where we could row around or sail around in the dinghies or go exploring or hiking or swimming. Or other times we got involved with tall ships or classic boat festivals. Here's North Star out with a replica of one of Columbus's ships, Nina. Here we are out sailing with the late great Bounty, who was lost not long after that. Everywhere we went, the ship drew crowds. Oftentimes people would come and knock on the boat, and they were from the north, and they would tell us stories and share pictures, some of which I've shared with you today. We brought school groups on board. Usually we'd put a teacher up in the bosun's chair while the kids all stomped around the capstan and sang sea shanties. Other times we'd bring them down and teach them about Arctic history and sovereignty. And we'd winter in Victoria while still living on board the ship. And eventually the kids all grew up and moved away, as they do and as they should. We got to take Sven out with one of Fred's daughters. She actually told me the story that she remembered watching through the skylight 2 of her siblings being born on our bunk. But with the children all left, all grown and left, and Sheila and I were looking for a new adventure, and the Vancouver Maritime Museum asked us to have North Star on display near St. Roch. And so we had a very eventful sail over, and we arrived late at night in Vancouver. And the next morning, as the tide rose, North Star and her old Arctic friend St. Roch were within sight of each other for the first time in 65 years. These 2 sisters of the ice. Thanks very much for your kind attention. And if there's any questions, I can answer them.
Okay, Ron, are you there? All right. Do we have any questions or comments from folks who've been watching here?
Well, my comment is, wow, thank you, Bruce. This is Barbara McNutt.
Hi,
And
Barbara.
we had 6 years working together at Toronto Brigantine.
We did 6 good years. 6 good years. Yep. Good to see you.
Likewise.
I think that
Chris,
Ron,
that was fantastic. And I'm just curious now, as part of the museum, are you still living aboard?
No, I'm still living on board. I've been on board 25 years now.
Excellent.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that if there are any of you Toronto folk are interested, I was talking to the Nautical Mind bookstore, and they've got copies of the book, and but you can buy it at any bookstore. You can buy it online if you're interested, and all the proceeds go towards the ship's maintenance fund. Yeah.
that's terrific to know. That was one of the questions I was going to ask. Where is your book available? Because you gave such an incredible amount of information. Oh, Victor's got it there. But you gave such an incredible amount of information that I think it really warrants a read of the book in order to solidify some of the thoughts and some of the things that have happened during that time of those 2 ships.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and that's just a smatter of just, it's a small part of it's a short book, but it's a small part of the stories. I had to truncate the talk somewhat, and hope it didn't sound too rushed, but it's available. It's also available as an ebook for those of you who like to be able to adjust the font, as some of us do as a age. Yeah.
Yes. I did have a question. One of the things that has surfaced, I guess, more recently than ever is that the Indigenous populations in Canada have been exploited. It didn't seem to me, although certainly some of the lifestyles that happened perhaps were exploitation, but did you see this adventure into the north, the whaling, the trapping as exploitation or as a mutual effort together?
Okay, it's a good question. I think that initially, yes, of course, I think there was some exploitation, but I think that as we weeded out the whalers more than anything, what this story really is, refreshingly is an indigenous success story. What we're talking about is people who, like I say, during the Depression were making money hand over fist just with their business acumen and their hard work. They refused any social assistance. Fred Carpenter wouldn't allow any social assistance, and he said, we'll look after our own. So very, very positive message, strong leadership, strong work. So yes, I believe that, yeah, there was some exploitation in the beginning, but I think that the Inuit could give as well as they could get, and they received something in return. Yeah, from dealing with the whalers and then later with the traders, but they certainly did well.
Mhm. I know that the whales were killed out in many ways, and I presume they've come back in the north because there isn't so much whaling up there. But what about the hunting of the foxes? I mean, that was a huge number of pelts, and you only showed us a tiny bit. What is the population of the foxes up there now?
They're infested with foxes up there.
Oh,
And one of the things that they thought was that when the whalers went up there for the baleen and knocked the heads off the whales, all these carcasses, tons of whale meat would drift ashore and the whales would eat, and so they would just get bigger and stronger and more prolific. And most of these islands up there are not inhabited. They're not being hunted or trapped. Hadn't been. So
okay, right.
so there was just, but I've got lots of stories, lots of pictures of the foxes actually just coming up to people's houses and just eating out of their hands, like, and they were just running around over the
Wow.
place. So yeah.
Wow.
Mhm.
I guess I want to add one more thing. If you're in Toronto and you have an opportunity, there is a whale exhibit at the ROM right
Yes,
now.
I've seen it. Yeah.
And the baleen, I was so glad you showed a picture of a man standing beside the baleen. When you think about that, that's like the teeth of a whale. And there we have twice as high as an individual, as a man, and that's the size of them. And when they actually have one there that you can feel and in a display, and you can see how hard these baleen are and why they would have been used for the corsets.
Oh, yeah.
And they, of course, the picture you had of the corset was exactly what they had on display there.
Yeah, they also use them for buggy whips and for umbrella handles and shoe horns. Just a strong, flexible material. This is just pre-plastic, right? So
pre-plastic, perfect pre-plastic. But the other aspect of that exhibit is that you really get such an overwhelming sense of how big a whale is, how huge a whale is. You really don't have that sense when you talk about it, but boy, when you're right beside one of those carcasses, or the skeletons, I beg your pardon.
well, one fine thing, one nice thing about this lockdown is that no one's been out on the water. There's been much less traffic on the water. And so we've been seeing more and more whales coming in close to shore here, and lots of gray whales and humpback whales. I've even had them swim right by the dock here. And yeah, you're right, they're humongous.
Nature is amazing. When you let it go, it lives. And I take you back to the Thames River, which was totally polluted, and everybody said, oh, we'll never have fish in the Thames River, but they stopped dumping junk in the river, and it may have taken 5 to 10 years, but that river is fishable and swimmable again.
Amazing.
Yeah, totally amazing. When we let nature take its course, it looks after itself.
Yes.
Are there any other questions or comments that people might have? Yes, Richard. You're muted, Dick. You have to unmute yourself. Bottom left corner, I think.
Yeah, I just want to thank Bruce for a great presentation. A
So
weird coincidence
Richard,
that
Richard Burchell, we're talking
Yeah.
to Dick Shibley right now. So just hang on a second.
Oh,
I'm
different,
very
Richard.
interested in when Canadian sovereignty was acknowledged by the Americans and the Russians and other countries that might have asserted a claim.
I missed the first part of that. Are you asking when did the other countries
Acknowledged
acknowledge?
the sovereignty of the North.
Well, it goes back to the King's Proclamation of 1873 when the King ceded the land from England to Canada. So at that point, they acknowledged that the Northern Arctic Islands, were Canadian. Though because we weren't policing it, because we weren't using it, it was seen as a no man's land. The issue becomes the very valuable stretch of water called the Northwest Passage that other countries have not acknowledged as Canadian. It'd be sort of like saying to the United States, we acknowledge that it's American soil on either side, but the Mississippi River is international. They wouldn't go for it. So.
And Richard Burchell now.
Hello, mate.
I just want to go with a great comment. Thank you very much for the story, Bruce. It's great to hear from you. And an unusual coincidence, back in England in Tooting Co-op, my mum used to fit ladies' corsets.
Yeah.
So connection way back to London.
Ah, that's funny. My wife once modeled for a vintage fashion show, and where they would you'd start off in a slip and then they would slowly put everything on. And one time in front of this audience, they cinched her into a corset and she got faint-headed because it sucks all the air out of your lungs when they're tightening it up. And the guy got so excited saying, oh, she's got the vapors. This is amazing. And she just about collapsed on stage. So anyway, they now run the Canadian Fashion Museum in Cambridge, Ontario. So there you go.
Noel, I think you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that the whaling up north stopped in the 60s. In the late 40s, I was in Churchill with my father. My father was asked to go up there by the federal government to open up the whaling plant in Churchill.
Right.
That was the reason we were out there. And what they were hunting at that time was beluga whales and stuff. And he knew then that, this was crazy. There wasn't enough oil in them anyway.
Right.
And by then, everything had gone to synthetics. So
that's right. Yeah. No, it was.
But I've got, my dad was a whaler before the war in the Antarctic, and I have pictures of him with the whales. Never mind the skeletons, the size of them when they're all together is very big.
Greasy work, tough work. Yeah.
Made a lot of money at it. He actually made enough money in the Antarctic to buy half the main street in Lillehammer, Norway. And he was 24 years old and says, what the hell does he need with half a town? So he bought a new car instead.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Sally's got her hand up here too.
Oh, Sally, okay.
You know what it's like to stop her.
Okay, when we were in
Okay, Sally, we can't see you. Move over.
Is that better?
Yep.
Okay, when we were in Newfoundland, we went into Red Bay, where they've got 3 whaling museums.
Oh.
They're very good at getting government grants. But we were we'd just been in Henley Harbor, and the graveyard in Henley Harbor was all Stone family graves. There was just 1 or 2 that were different from the Stone family. So one of the guys on the wharf introduced me to one of the guys that worked on the roll-off, roll-on ferry. And I looked at him and said, oh, sure, you must be Mr. Stone. And he said, no, that's my dad.
Yeah.
But it was funny because they used the baleen as roofing material on the sheds. And he remembered when they tore down the shed because it had fallen through weight of snow and stuff, that they just picked up huge sheets of baleen and chucked it into the sea because they had to clear for the vegetable patch.
Amazing. I've never heard of that being used, but it makes sense. It's strong and watertight, flexible. Huh.
Yep.
Yeah.
Huh. Very good.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, I thank all of you, and Bruce, thank you so much for working through the technology at the beginning and making sure that you got here for us, because your presentation was totally, utterly fascinating.
Well, thank
I thank you for that. I am presenting you with a small pin, which I will mail to you as a token of our appreciation for speaking to us today. And I've also added you to our mailing list, so I hope you will join us for other presentations that we may have.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much. And thanks all everybody for your kind attention and for listening, and nice to see the familiar faces again.
Yeah, really.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And so upcoming next week, we have Ron Jenkins, who is going to return as a Shellback presenter for the 9th time. He will take us to the Toronto Island Airport, its pasts, because there have been different pasts, the present, and the possible futures. And I add an S to that because the plans seem to vary from one place to the other. And I know we've heard a little bit about this before, but he's going to include the airlines that have flown there, Billy Bishop's history, plans that did not come to fruition, and plans for the future, including the effects of COVID, climate change, and what happens to the tripartite agreement between the federal government, the provincial government, and the city government when it expires in 2033. And then the following week, we have Alex Preston, and he's an assistant Antarctic tour guide, and he brings us an historic polar adventure of 6 degrees of Fridtjof Nansen, probably the most important polar explorer since Captain James Cook. In many ways, he revolutionized polar travel and had a direct impact on all the explorers that followed. So it'll be interesting to compare some of what he says to what you said, Bruce, with all the Arctic explorers, only this time we're looking at the Antarctic. And so I look forward to seeing all or most of you next week. And with that, pipes out. And don't forget about the post rooms. And you'll see, I think you just have to find, Ron will put up a link so you can go into an after room. Here we are, breakout room. I'm joining.